wasn't my tale.
The storms of Talaris announced themselves an hour before they arrived, a wall of violet lightning stitching itself across the horizon like a wound that refused to close. Dr. Senara Vale stood at the edge of the landing platform, one boot braced on a crate of surveying equipment, and watched the sky get angry. Her tail, russet-furred, absurdly large even by Vulpine standards, and possessed of what she was fairly certain was a malicious will of its own, swept an empty ration tin off the crate and sent it clattering over the platform's edge into the jungle canopy below. She didn't flinch. 26 years of living with the thing had taught her to expect at least one act of small sabotage per hour. "That's going to happen to you," she told it without looking down. "Eventually. Off a cliff. And I won't even feel bad." The tail, naturally, did not respond. It never did. It simply flicked, self-satisfied, and resumed its pose draped over her shoulder like a scarf that had opinions. Talaris spread beneath the platform in every shade of green a person could imagine and several a person probably shouldn't. Broken stone spires jutted from the canopy at odd angles, remnants of a civilization that had built cities in the sky before it built anything at all on the ground, or so the surviving fragments of Vulpine scripture claimed. Somewhere beneath all that green, in a temple no living cartographer had mapped and no living explorer had returned from, was the Heart of Vaelora. And somewhere in that same temple, 20 years ago, was where her mother had disappeared. Senara touched the strap of her satchel, where a photograph, actual paper, actual ink, a relic from before anyone bothered printing memories onto anything that would last, sat folded against her ribs. Mira Vale, laughing, one hand shading her eyes against the sun on some other world entirely, 3 weeks before she vanished into the green. "I'm going to find you," Senara thought, the way she thought it every single time she stood at the edge of a jungle that might finally give her mother back. "Or I'm going to find out what happened to you. Either one. I'm not leaving this moon without an answer." The sound of an engine long overdue for maintenance coughed somewhere above the storm line, and Senara's ears, flatter and more expressive than any human's, currently pinned back in irritation, swiveled toward it before her eyes even found the source. "No," she said out loud, to no one. "Absolutely not. Not him." The ship that dropped out of the cloud cover was a battered, patched-together transport that had clearly been 3 different vessels in 3 different decades before someone welded the surviving pieces into a single defiant whole. Its paint job had faded to the color of old rust, except for a hand-painted name across the hull that someone had touched up more recently than the rest, the Second Chance. Senara's tail, which apparently had more foresight than she did, wrapped itself once around her ankle in what she chose to interpret as solidarity. The ship's ramp hissed open before it had fully finished landing, which was either impressive piloting or reckless idiocy, and out stepped a man Senara had spent 5 years trying very hard not to think about. Elias Rook hadn't changed much. Still too handsome for anyone's good, in the particular way of men who knew it, and had decided to be charming about it rather than insufferable, though Senara maintained there was a fine line between the two and he crossed it regularly. Still wearing that ridiculous flight jacket with more pockets than any human being could possibly need. Still grinning like the universe was a joke only he was in on. "Vale," he said, spreading his arms as if he expected an embrace. "You look like you're about to shoot me." "I'm considering it," Senara said. "Weighing the pros and cons. Give me a moment. Pros, closure. Cons, I'm the only pilot within 4-star systems reckless enough to fly you through that." He nodded up at the storm wall, now considerably closer and considerably angrier. "You're welcome, by the way. I didn't hire you." "No," Elias agreed cheerfully. "You hired the guild. The guild subcontracted to me." "Which means, technically, you did hire me, you just didn't get a say in it, which I personally think is the funniest possible outcome, and I intend to enjoy it for the rest of this trip." Senara's tail, entirely without her permission, gave one slow, considering swish, the Vulpine equivalent of a held breath. She yanked it still with more effort than she wanted to admit. You stole my map, she said. 5 years ago. You stole my map and you left me in the Kessa ruins with a collapsed passage and a very angry swarm of cave wasps. And now you're going to stand there and call it a funny outcome? Something flickered behind Elias's easy grin, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it, if she hadn't spent 3 years of her life learning to read every twitch of that infuriating face. I came back for you, he said, quieter. You came back because you lost the map in a card game 2 systems over and needed me to help you find it again. That's... He paused. That's also true. Both things can be true. They can, Senara agreed. And yet only one of them makes you a hero, Rook, and it isn't the one where you needed my help. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the platform, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, hissing against the hot stone. Elias glanced up at the sky, then back at her, and for a moment the charm dropped away entirely, replaced by something that looked almost like the boy she'd known before he became this performance of a man. We can fight about this in the air, he said. Or we can fight about it on the ground when your mother's temple falls into the ocean because we wasted the weather window arguing. Your call, Archaeologist. Senara's jaw tightened. Her tail, damn it, uncurled from around her ankle and drifted toward the ship's ramp, apparently voting on its own behalf. Fine, she said. But I'm sitting up front. And if you say one more word about the wasps, I will feed you to the next thing that stings. Wouldn't dream of it, Elias said, already turning for the ramp, that grin sliding back into place like a mask he wore more comfortably than his own face. Welcome aboard the second chance, Dr. Vale. Try not to fall in love with her. Everyone does. I hate you, Senara said, following him up the ramp anyway, because the storm was coming and her mother's temple was waiting and some fights simply had to wait their turn. The second chance handled the storm the way its captain handled most things, with more confidence than sense, and just enough skill to make the recklessness look intentional. Senara spent the descent with both hands locked around the edges of her seat, watching lightning fork past the viewport close enough to paint the cockpit violet, and refused to give Elias the satisfaction of hearing her scream. She dug her claws into the armrest instead. Small mercies. You could say thank you, Elias called over the shriek of wind against the hull, hands moving across the controls with the easy competence of a man who'd flown through worse. For not dying. I could also say nothing, Senara said, which is what I'm choosing to do. Your tail's doing that thing. She glanced down. Her tail had wound itself so tightly around the seat's support strut that it had gone rigid, every hair standing on end. My tail does not consult me before making decisions, Senara said with as much dignity as she could manage. It hasn't for 26 years. I've made my peace with it. I think it likes me. It likes drama. There's a difference. It liked the wasps too, right up until they stung it. Elias laughed, a real laugh, sudden and startled out of him, and something in Senara's chest did an unwelcome, complicated thing in response. She looked back out the viewport instead of examining it further. They broke through the storm's belly with a final bone-jarring lurch, and the jungle canopy of Talaris opened beneath them, a green ocean stretching to every horizon, broken by the crooked fingers of ruined towers reaching up through the mist like the moon itself was trying to remember something it had lost. There, Senara breathed, pointing. Ahead, half swallowed by vine and time, a stepped ziggurat rose above the canopy, its surface carved with spiraling glyphs that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. That's it. That's the temple complex. My mother's last transmission put her 3 kilometers north of that exact structure. Elias whistled low. Big place to lose someone. She wasn't lost, Senara said, sharper than she meant to. She was taken. Or she found something she wasn't supposed to. There's a difference, and I intend to find out which. Elias didn't answer that, which she appreciated more than she'd admit. He guided the ship down through a gap in the canopy instead, settling it in a small clearing choked with flowering vines that immediately began curling toward the hot metal of the hull like they were hungry for it. Welcome to paradise, Elias said, cutting the engines. Try not to touch anything purple. Or anything that moves. Or anything that looks like it isn't moving but might start. So, everything. Now you're getting it. The jungle of Talaris was alive in a way that felt almost personal. Every leaf the size of a door. Every shadow deep enough to hide something with teeth. Senara led the way with a hand scanner in one palm and her pulse pistol loose in its holster, her ears constantly swiveling to track sounds that didn't belong. The wrong kind of rustle, the too quiet space where insects should have been singing. Your mother came this way? Elias asked, ducking under a vine thick as his torso. Her last transmission mentioned a threshold of teeth. Senara consulted her notes, translated a decade ago from fragments of her mother's field journal. Vulpine ruin poetry. Could mean anything. Probably means something with actual teeth, knowing this place. Comforting. I never said it would be comfortable. I said it would be worth it. They walked in something that wasn't quite silence. Talaris didn't allow for true silence, not with its constant chorus of chittering things and dripping canopy and somewhere distant, a low bellow that made Senara's tail flatten protectively against her leg, but it was close enough to let old thoughts crowd back in. Elias. She said his name before she'd fully decided to. Why did you come back? The real answer. Not the funny one. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then, I heard Cash and Vayer had a contract out on this expedition. Yours specifically. And I figured you'd walk into it anyway because you're too stubborn to let a little thing like a bounty change your plans. And somebody who actually knew this jungle should probably be standing next to you when it went wrong. That's not funny at all. No, Elias agreed. It isn't. Senara opened her mouth to press further. Because 5 years of anger didn't dissolve on a single half-honest sentence, no matter how much her tail seemed to think it should, but the ground gave a low, grinding shudder beneath her boots, and the threshold of teeth announced itself in spectacular fashion. The vines ahead parted like a curtain being drawn, revealing not a doorway but a mouth. An enormous stone archway carved in the shape of some ancient predator's jaw, rows of broken stalactite, teeth, hanging from its upper edge, more still jutting up from a floor slick with moss and old rain. That's not ominous at all, Elias said. It's a threshold, Senara said, already moving toward it, scanner whirring. My mother wrote about it like it was a test. A filter. Something the temple built to keep out anyone who wasn't. She stopped. Wasn't what? Worthy. Senara made a face. Ancient civilizations loved that word. Never once considered that worthy might just mean has the right number of legs and doesn't set off pressure plates. As if summoned by the thought, her tail chose that exact moment to sweep low across the ground behind her, brushing against a raised stone tile half hidden under moss. The tile sank an inch into the floor with an audible click. Oh no, Senara said. What? The stone teeth above the archway began to descend, not quickly, but with the horrible, unstoppable patience of ancient machinery finally getting to do the one job it had waited centuries to do. Somewhere deeper in the passage, gears the size of wagon wheels groaned to life. Run, Senara said, and didn't wait to see if Elias agreed. They bolted through the closing jaw, Senara's tail streaming behind her like a banner, and unhelpfully, brushing 2 more pressure plates on the way past. One triggering a hail of small stone darts from the walls, the other causing an entire section of floor to drop away into blackness a half-second after Elias's boot left it. Your tail is trying to kill us, Elias shouted, ducking a dart that would have taken his ear off. My tail is trying to kill me, Senara corrected, diving through the narrowing gap of the closing jaw with half a second to spare, Elias close enough behind her that his shoulder clipped stone as the archway sealed shut with a boom that shook dust from the ceiling. You're just collateral damage. They lay in a heap on the far side, breathing hard, the passage beyond them dim and dripping and, for the moment, still. I take it back, Elias said, staring at the ceiling. I don't think it likes me. I think it's an agent of chaos with no particular loyalties. Welcome to 26 years of my life, Senara said, and let herself laugh, once, short and startled, before hauling herself back to her feet. Come on. If the threshold's this dramatic, I want to see what it's protecting. The passage opened, an hour and several near misses later, into a cavern so vast that Senara's handheld light couldn't find its ceiling. A chasm split the space in two, its bottom lost in a darkness that seemed to breathe, and across the gap, strung between two crumbling stone pillars, hung a rope bridge that had clearly not been maintained by anyone in several centuries. There has to be another way, Elias said, eyeing the bridge with the particular suspicion of a man who had fallen through several similar structures in his career. There isn't. I checked the schematics my mother recorded. This is the only crossing. Senara was already testing the first plank with her boot. It held. Barely. Unless you'd like to fly the ship through a cave opening roughly the width of its cockpit. Tempting, but no. They crossed carefully, one at a time, the bridge swaying with every gust of wind that came howling up from the chasm's depths. Senara's tail, for once, mercifully, stayed wrapped tight around her own waist rather than reaching for trouble, as if even it understood the stakes. They were 3/4 across when the first rope snapped. The bridge lurched violently sideways. Senara's stomach dropped with it. She grabbed the guide rope with both hands, claws digging in, and heard Elias swear behind her as a second and third plank gave way in quick succession, the whole structure beginning to peel apart from the far end like old fabric. Move! Elias shouted. Vael, move! She moved. She half ran, half scrambled across the disintegrating bridge, feeling planks vanish from beneath her boots a heartbeat after she'd left them, her tail whipping out on pure animal instinct to wrap around the support rope and yank her forward when her own momentum faltered. She reached the far ledge and spun, already reaching back, and found Elias 6 feet short, standing on a bridge that had nothing left ahead of him but open air and a very long drop. Jump! She shouted. I'm working on the mental math here, hold on. There is no math, Elias, there's a chasm and a decision, jump! He jumped. For one endless second he hung in the open dark, jacket flapping, and Senara's hand shot out and caught his wrist with a grip that would leave bruises on both of them, her tail hooking around a stone outcrop behind her to anchor them both against the drag of his weight. For a moment they simply hung there. Him dangling half over the chasm, her braced against the ledge, both of them breathing like they'd run a marathon, and then Senara hauled, and Elias's boots found purchase on the stone, and they collapsed in a tangle on solid ground. You caught me, Elias said, sounding almost surprised. Don't get used to it, Senara said, though she hadn't let go of his wrist yet. She noticed, and let go immediately, and told herself the warmth in her face was exertion and nothing else. I need you alive! You're the only one who can fly us out of here. Sure, Elias said, and there was something soft under the word that she didn't examine too closely. That's exactly why. Beyond the chasm, the passage sloped downward into water, black, cold, and rising almost imperceptibly, which told Senara this section of the temple was actively flooding, on some schedule tied to tides or rains she couldn't see from here. Catacombs, she said, wading in up to her knees, scanner held above the waterline. My mother mentioned these. She called them the Hall of Listening. Said the walls remembered sound. Remembered how? I don't know yet. That's why we're here. The water rose to her waist as they went, then her chest, forcing them to swim through sections where the ceiling dropped low enough to brush against Senara's ears. Bioluminescent moss clung to the walls, casting everything in a faint blue-green glow, and carved into the stone at intervals were rows of vulpine glyphs that seemed to shimmer when the light hit them just right, as though something inside the rock itself were listening back. Elias, treading water beside her, reached out to touch one of the glyphs. The moment his fingers made contact, a low hum vibrated through the water, and for one disorienting second, Senara heard, not with her ears, but somewhere behind them, in the part of her skull where memory lived, a voice. Mira. Mira Vael. Turn back. Senara went rigid. Did you hear that? Hear what? A voice. It said. She stopped, throat tight. It said my mother's name. Elias's teasing expression fell away entirely. Senara. I'm fine. Keep moving. We need to find the exit before this floods completely. They swam on, but Senara's mind stayed snagged on those two words. Turn back. Had her mother heard the same warning, 20 years ago, in this same black water? Had she ignored it, the way Senara fully intended to? Of course she ignored it, Senara thought, kicking harder against the rising water. She was a Vael. We don't turn back. We just find out the hard way why we should have. The passage finally sloped upward, breaking the surface into a gasping, dripping chamber lit by shafts of gray daylight filtering through cracks far overhead. They hauled themselves out onto dry stone, both soaked through, both shaking with cold and adrenaline in equal measure. You okay? Elias asked, and for once there was no performance in it at all. I will be, Senara said. Once I know what happened to her. He didn't push. He just sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, and let the silence be enough for a while. Past the flooded catacombs, before the jungle opened into predator territory, they stumbled on a chamber Senara's mother had never mentioned, which meant, as far as Senara was concerned, that it was hers to discover fresh, the first purely new thing she'd found on this entire expedition that didn't come preloaded with grief. It was small, almost domestic in scale compared to the temple's cavernous halls, a round room lined floor to ceiling with tiny carved alcoves, each one holding a fist-sized stone marker etched with a single name in old Vulpine script. A shrine, Senara breathed, running her fingers along a row of markers without touching them. Not to gods. Not to guardians. She swallowed. To people. Whoever built this temple, they kept a record of everyone who came looking for it, and didn't make it out. A memorial, generations deep. Elias moved along the opposite wall, reading names he couldn't translate but recognized as names all the same, simple, human-shaped grief carved into stone by people long dead themselves. You think she's in here somewhere? Senara's search was slower than she wanted it to be, her hands trembling as she checked alcove after alcove, dreading and hoping in equal measure. She found it near the room's center, in a section clearly newer than the ones around it, the stones still sharp-edged where centuries of dust hadn't yet softened its carving. Vael. She did not fail. She chose. Someone, something, had known. The temple itself, or whatever intelligence lingered in it, had understood what her mother did in that final chamber and had honored it, unprompted, the way the builders had honored every explorer brave or foolish enough to come this far. Senara pressed her palm flat against the cool stone and didn't try to stop the tears this time. She wasn't alone when it happened, she said. Whatever this place is, it saw her. It knew what she did and it remembered her for it. She let out a shaking breath. 20 years I pictured her dying afraid, in the dark, with no one to know what happened. She had this instead. A place that understood. Elias didn't offer platitudes. He simply crossed the room, sat down beside her on the cold floor, and let her grieve in a silence that didn't ask her to hurry through it. When this is over, Senara said eventually, wiping her face with the back of one hand, I want to come back here. Properly. Catalog every name in this room. Make sure none of them get forgotten a second time. I'll fly you, Elias said. Every time. However many trips it takes. You say that now. I mean it now. Ask me again in a decade, I'll still mean it. She believed him. That, more than anything that had happened on the rope bridge or in the water, was the moment Senara realized she'd already forgiven him. She just hadn't found the right sentence to say it in yet. They didn't get long to rest. The bellow Senara had heard earlier, distant and low, sounded again, closer now, and answered by a second, and a third. Something large was moving through the jungle above the catacombs, and judging by the tremor that ran through the stone beneath them, large was an understatement. We need to move, Senara said, already scrambling up. They emerged from the ruins into late afternoon light and immediately understood the source of the bellowing, a trio of scaled, six-legged predators the size of transport vehicles, moving through the trees with the unhurried confidence of animals that had never once lost the hunt. Those weren't in the survey data, Elias said. The survey data is 20 years old and was compiled by a team that never came back, Senara said. Run. They ran. The jungle blurred past in streaks of green and shadow, the ground shaking with each thundering step behind them, Senara's tail streaming out flat and straight for once, too busy with survival to cause trouble. They ducked under fallen trunks, vaulted over root systems, and Elias, showing an entirely different kind of recklessness than his flying, one born of genuine terror, hauled Senara bodily over a ravine rather than risk the extra 3 seconds it would take her to jump it herself. They lost the predators, eventually, by scrambling into a narrow crevice between two boulders too tight for the creature's bulk, and pressed themselves into the dark, breathing hard, listening to enormous claws rake uselessly at the stone outside. I liked you better when you were annoying and not terrifying, Senara whispered. I contain multitudes, Elias whispered back, and despite everything, despite the very real danger still scraping at the rocks 6 inches from her face, Senara found herself smiling into the dark. By the time the predators lost interest and lumbered off towards some other unlucky quarry, the light was fading fast, and Senara's scanner showed the temple's central chamber less than half a kilometer ahead. Close enough that she refused to stop for the night. Just a little further, she said. The heart's chamber should be right past this next section. The next section turned out to be a room straight out of every archaeologist's nightmare. A wide stone hall, floor tiled in an obvious pattern of pressure plates, walls lined with dart slots and swinging blade mechanisms, all of it clearly rigged to a central mechanism that would, Senara's scanner informed her cheerfully, trigger everything at once if disturbed correctly. Please, Elias said. Please tell me there's a safe path. There's a safe path, Senara said, studying the glyphs along the ceiling. According to the pattern, if we step only on the tiles marked with the crescent glyph. Her tail chose that precise moment to make an executive decision. It swept low, brushing against no fewer than 4 separate pressure plates in one smooth, catastrophic arc, apparently operating on a philosophy of maximum chaos, minimum warning. Oh, you have got to be kidding me, Senara said, as the entire chamber erupted around them. Darts hissing from every wall, blades swinging down from the ceiling in wide, scything arcs, the floor itself beginning to tilt on some grinding pivot mechanism that clearly hadn't been triggered in centuries and was making up for lost time. Move! Elias bellowed, and grabbed her hand, and they ran a chamber that was actively trying to kill them from every possible direction at once, ducking blades, leaping darts, Senara's tail. Now fully repentant, or possibly just as terrified as the rest of her, curling protectively around her own leg instead of causing further disaster. They reached the far archway in a final desperate dive, tumbling through just as the floor behind them tilted fully vertical and dumped every remaining dart, blade, and loose stone into a churning pit below. They lay there afterward, tangled together, both laughing in the specific unhinged way of people who had just nearly died and hadn't quite processed it yet. Your tail, Elias wheezed, owes me an apology. My tail, Senara said, still catching her breath, owes me several years of therapy. He turned his head to look at her, close enough that she could count the small scar above his eyebrow she didn't remember from 5 years ago, and something in his expression went quiet and serious in a way that made her pulse do something complicated. I'm sorry, he said. For real this time? Not the funny version. Senara didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. Tell me, she said instead. The whole thing. Why you left? They sat with their backs against cool stone, sharing the last of the ration bars from Senara's pack, the chamber's danger behind them and the temple's heart somewhere still ahead. Cashin found me a week before the Kessa expedition, Elias said, staring at nothing. Sent men to the bar where I was drinking, very politely explained that if I didn't disappear with the map and leave you stranded, he'd make sure you didn't survive the trip at all. Said it like he was doing me a favor, giving me a choice. His jaw tightened. I didn't have a choice. Not really. I could abandon you somewhere you'd be furious but alive, or I could watch him kill you in front of me. So I took the map and I ran, and I told myself I'd fix it once you were safely away from him. Senara's chest went tight. You could have told me. Warned me. He was listening. He had people everywhere, Senara, he still does. If I'd so much as hinted, he'd have known, and he'd have hurt you just to prove a point. Disappearing was the only lever I had. Make him think it worked. Buy you time to get clear. He finally looked at her. I came back the second I thought it was safe. You just happened to already be furious about the map by then, and the furious version of the story was easier to let you believe than the one where I nearly got you killed by staying. Senara sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way she'd turn over a shard of pottery, looking for the parts that fit and the parts that didn't. That's an infuriatingly good excuse, she said finally. It's not an excuse. It's what happened. I know. She exhaled, long and slow. I believe you. I've spent 5 years being angry at a story that isn't true, and I don't. She stopped, shook her head. I don't know what to do with that yet. Ask me again after we're not about to be crushed by a temple. Fair, Elias said, and something in his shoulders eased, like he'd been braced for a different answer. For what it's worth, I never stopped feeling like I owed you the rest of that expedition. This one too. You don't owe me anything. I know, he said, echoing her. I'm doing it anyway. Senara's tail, entirely too pleased with itself, curled once around Elias's ankle and settled there like it had found exactly where it wanted to be. She let it, this time, without complaint. They didn't reach the central chamber before nightfall after all. The temple, apparently unwilling to let them arrive unscarred, gave them one final obstacle in the form of simple exhaustion. Senara's hands were shaking too badly to trust on a climb, and Elias had a gash along his ribs from a dart he hadn't mentioned until he nearly passed out rewrapping it, so they made camp in a small side chamber where the roof still held and the floor, for once, held no pressure plates that Senara's scanner could find. Hold still, Senara said, kneeling beside him with the medkit from her satchel, cleaning the wound by the light of a single glow stick. You should have said something hours ago. You were busy talking to ghosts and getting nearly crushed by a floor. Didn't seem like the moment. There's always a moment for I've been shot, actually. Grazed. Very different word. She tied off the bandage with more force than strictly necessary, and Elias hissed, and she didn't apologize. They sat afterward with their backs against the same stretch of wall, the ruins' ancient hum settling around them like the temple itself was breathing slow and even in its sleep. Somewhere above the canopy, Talaris' second moon had risen, pale and enormous, its light falling through a crack in the ceiling to paint a long silver stripe across the floor between them. Can I ask you something? Elias said. And you don't have to answer if it's a mother-shaped question. Ask. What were you going to do before all this? If you'd never found this place? If the map had just stayed lost, and Cashin had never come sniffing around, and none of it ever happened? What does an archaeologist do with a life that isn't waiting for an answer? Senara considered the question longer than she expected to need. I used to think I'd keep excavating other people's mysteries forever. Smaller ruins. Safer ones. I told myself I'd stopped actively looking for her years ago. She picked at a loose thread on her jacket cuff. I hadn't. Every site I ever chose, I chose because it was 1 degree closer to this moon. I just didn't let myself say that part out loud. And now? Now I know what happened. Now I get to decide what comes next without her hanging over every decision like an unanswered question. She glanced sideways at him. It's terrifying, actually. Having a life that isn't shaped entirely around finding her. You'll fill it with something, Elias said. Knowing you, probably something that also tries to kill us both. Probably, Senara agreed, and let herself smile in the dark. You could stick around for that part too. If you wanted. I generally want whatever keeps me standing near you, Elias said, quiet enough that it didn't sound like a line at all. Which is either the best or worst instinct I've ever had, depending on the day. Her tail, unbothered by subtlety, uncurled from her waist and draped itself loosely across his knee, staking a claim it had apparently been building toward for the better part of a decade. Either of them moved it. They didn't talk about Cashin, or the Guardians, or what waited in the morning. For one stolen hour in a ruin older than either of their families' recorded histories, they simply sat in the moonlight and let the silence hold something gentler than survival. Sleep, when it came easily, Senara's head eventually finding Elias's shoulder without either of them commenting on it, the glow stick burning low between them, the temple keeping its silent watch until dawn. The central chamber, when they finally reached it, was unlike anything Senara had photographed, sketched, or imagined in 20 years of study. A vast domed hall opened above them, its ceiling a spiral of interlocking glyphs that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves at the edge of vision, catching the last gray light of dusk through an oculus far overhead. At the room's center, atop a dais carved in the shape of cupped hands, sat the Heart of Vaelora. A crystal the size of a fist, glowing faintly from within like a coal that had never quite gone cold, pulsing in a slow rhythm that Senara realized, with a chill, matched her own heartbeat. That's it, she breathed. That's actually it. 20 years and it's just been sitting here, Elias said. Waiting. Not waiting. Senara approached slowly, scanner forgotten, every instinct in her sharpening. Remembering. That's what the Hall of Listening was telling us. That's what this whole temple does. She stopped a foot from the dais, hands trembling slightly. My mother's notes. She thought the heart controlled the guardians. Commanded them. But that's not right, is it? It doesn't command anything. It just holds on. To everyone who's ever touched it. She reached out and closed her fingers around the crystal. The world dissolved. Senara stood, or didn't stand, existed in some way that had nothing to do with standing, in a memory that wasn't hers. Her mother, 20 years younger than the photograph in Senara's satchel, stood in this same chamber, hand pressed to this same crystal, surrounded by 6 stone guardians rising from alcoves Senara hadn't even noticed on the way in. Miravale's face was calm. Terrified, but calm, in the specific way of someone who had already made a decision, and was simply waiting for her body to catch up to it. I'm sorry, Senara, her mother said, not to the memory, not to anyone in the room, but to some point in the future her mother must have somehow known would be watching. The guardians aren't monsters. They're a lock. And every lock needs someone to hold the key still, or it comes undone. I found the temple. I found the heart. And I understood, right at the end, that someone was always going to have to stay behind to make sure Talaris never falls into the wrong hands. I chose to be the one. Not because I didn't want to come home to you. Because I wanted you to have a home to come back to. The image flickered. Miravale's hand pressing the crystal into a socket at the base of the dais, the guardian stilling, folding back into stone, the chamber sealing itself around her as the memory folded in on itself like a page turning shut. I love you more than any discovery I ever made, her mother's voice said, fading now, the memory releasing its hold. Find the heart. Don't take it. Whatever you do, don't let anyone weaponize what I died to seal away. Senara came back to herself on her knees, the crystal still clutched in both hands, tears she hadn't noticed falling now cold on her face. Elias was crouched beside her, one hand steady on her back, having clearly been there through all of it without a single word. She sealed them, Senara said, voice raw. She didn't disappear. She chose. She sacrificed herself to lock the guardians away so no one could ever use them. A broken, disbelieving laugh escaped her. She was a hero. My mother was an actual hero, and I spent 20 years thinking she just got lost. She sounds like you, Elias said quietly. Senara looked at him, and for once had nothing sharp to say back. That was, of course, exactly when Lord Cashenvair's men blew the chamber's far doors off their hinges. He entered the way he did everything, unhurried, immaculate, flanked by armed mercenaries who fanned out through the chamber like they'd rehearsed it, which they probably had. Lord Cashenvair had the particular polish of a man who had never once in his life needed to run from anything, because he'd always arranged for someone else to do the running, or the dying, on his behalf. "Dr. Vale," he said, as though greeting an old colleague at a conference rather than a woman he'd once put a bounty on. "And Mr. Rook. How touching! A reunion tour. Cashen." Senara rose slowly, the heart still clutched in one hand, positioning herself between the crystal and the guns without quite deciding to. "You're too late. There's nothing here for you. There's a temple full of stone soldiers and an artifact that commands them," Cashen said pleasantly. "I'd call that something." His eyes flicked to the crystal in her hand. "And you're holding exactly what I came for. How efficient of you to find it." "It doesn't command anything," Senara said. "It remembers. My mother died making sure no one could ever use it the way you think you can." "Mira Vale," Cashen said, and something almost fond passed over his face, which was somehow worse than open malice. "Brilliant woman. Terrible negotiator. I offered her a fortune for exactly what you're offering me for free right now. She chose to disappear into a wall instead." He extended one gloved hand. "I'd rather you make a smarter choice than your mother did, Dr. Vale. Give me the heart, and you and Mr. Rook walk out of this temple alive. I have no interest in killing either of you. I only need what's in your hand. Over my dead body," Elias said, stepping up beside Senara, hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip even as a dozen mercenary rifles tracked the movement. "That can absolutely be arranged," Cashen said, still pleasant, still smiling, and nodded once to his men. What happened next happened very fast. Senara didn't remember deciding to run. She remembered Elias shouting her name, remembered the chamber exploding into gunfire and shouting and the thunderous grinding sound of the 6 stone guardians in their alcoves beginning, impossibly, terribly, to stir, because Cashen's men had already found the socket at the base of the dais, the one from her mother's memory, and jammed something into it that wasn't the heart but was close enough to half-wake what her mother had spent her life sealing shut. "You don't even need the crystal," Senara realized, horrified, backing away as stone hands the size of transport crates flexed to life. "You just need it close." "Marvelous, isn't it?" Cashen said, utterly unbothered by the 6-ton nightmare currently rising from stone's sleep 6 feet away from him. "Now, the heart, Dr. Vale. Or I let them finish waking on their own terms, and we'll see whose terms are worse for everyone in this room." Senara looked down at the crystal in her hand. Felt, for one dizzying second, the phantom weight of every hand that had ever held it before hers, including her mother's, 20 years and one impossible choice ago. "Whatever you do, don't let anyone weaponize what I died to seal away." There was no version of this where she handed it over and trusted Cashen's word. There was no version where she ran fast enough to escape both the guardians and the guns. There was only the choice her mother had already made once, in this same chamber, staring down the same impossible math. "Elias," Senara said very quietly, not looking away from Cashen. "When I say run, I need you to actually run. No arguing. Not this time. Senara. Promise me." He didn't promise. But he didn't argue either, which from Elias Rook was close enough. Senara raised the Heart of Vaelora over her head, and Cashen's expression finally, satisfyingly, cracked from pleasant into alarm. "Don't," he started. She threw it. Not to him. Not away from him. Straight down, into the widening crack at the center of the dais where the Guardian's waking mechanism churned. The one weak point her mother's notes, translated and retranslated 100 times over 20 years, had always insisted existed, buried in a single line of ruined poetry Senara had never fully understood until this exact second. "The heart that seals may also break the lock, if broken in the lock's own place. The crystal shattered. The chamber didn't explode so much as it simply began to end, stone splitting from stone in long groaning fractures that spread outward from the dais like ice cracking on a lake, the 6 half-Vulcan guardians freezing mid-motion and then, slowly, terribly, crumbling back into inert rubble as whatever animating force the heart had held together finally, fully released. "Run!" Senara screamed, and this time Elias didn't hesitate. Cassion's men scattered as the ceiling began to shed enormous slabs of stone. Cassion himself, no longer pleasant, no longer unbothered, was already sprinting for the exit he'd blown open minutes earlier, shouting orders no one had time left to follow. Senara didn't watch to see whether he made it. She was too busy running for her life across a floor that was disintegrating faster than her boots could find purchase. The chasm they'd crossed by rope bridge that morning had, in the hours since, widened dramatically as the temple's foundations gave way beneath it, and by the time Senara and Elias reached its edge, there was no bridge left at all, only a gap easily 20 feet across, growing wider by the second, with a drop beneath it that disappeared into churning dust and darkness. "We're not going to make that," Elias said. "We don't have a choice. There's always a—" He looked at her face. "Okay." No time for the speech. On 3? On 3. They ran, and jumped, and for one horrible, weightless second Senara was certain the gap had already won, that 20 feet had been an underestimate, that this was how it ended, not with an answer about her mother but as a matching statistic in the same temple's long list of the lost. Then Elias's hand closed around hers in midair, and momentum swung them both toward the far ledge instead of the drop, and they hit stone hard enough to knock the breath from both their lungs, skidding, scrabbling, Senara's tail, heavy, absurd, constantly inconvenient, suddenly the one thing threatening to drag them both back over the edge as its trailing weight caught on nothing but momentum and gravity. "Let go of the tail instinct and grab the wall," Elias gasped, one arm looping around her waist, the other locked white-knuckled onto a jutting outcrop of stone, holding both their combined weight against the temple actively trying to swallow them. "I'm trying. I've got you," he said, and for the second time in one impossible day, he meant it with his whole chest, no performance anywhere in it. "I'm not letting go. Not this time. Not ever again if you'll let me not." Senara's claws finally found the wall. Her tail, as if it had been waiting for exactly that permission, whipped around and hooked itself securely around a stone spar, taking its own share of the weight for the first time in her entire life, and together, her, Elias, and one deeply overdue tail, they hauled themselves up onto solid ground as the last of the chasm's far wall sheared away into dust behind them. They found Cassion's trail before they found Cassion. Half a kilometer from the collapsing valley, in a clearing scorched black by some panicked mercenary's misfired weapon, they found an abandoned equipment case, its lock still sealed, its owner nowhere in sight. Elias crouched to examine it while Senara kept watch, pulse pistol drawn, ears swiveling for any sign of pursuit. "He's not coming back for this," Elias said, prying the case open with the edge of his knife. Inside, cushioned in foam, sat a second, smaller crystal fragment. Not glowing, not humming, just an ordinary shard of quartz that someone had clearly tried and failed to convince themselves was a piece of the heart. "Looks like our friend Cassion grabbed the wrong rock in the chaos and didn't stick around to check his work." Senara almost laughed. "All that, and he ran off the moon with a paperweight. Poetic, really. He'll be back," Senara said, sobering. "Men like Cassion don't stop because they lost one round. He'll spend the next year convincing himself the heart can be rebuilt, or that there's another one somewhere, or that I know more than I've told him. This isn't over. It's just paused. Then we'll be ready when it isn't paused anymore," Elias said, tossing the fake fragment into the underbrush with a shrug that didn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. "Preferably from a much greater distance next time. With better guns." "Agreed," Senara said. "Also, I'm keeping the pistol pointed at every shadow until we're back in orbit. Just so we're clear. Wouldn't dream of arguing." They didn't find Cassion himself, In the end, only a hurried set of footprints leading to a scorched patch of jungle where a second, smaller ship had clearly waited and lifted off in a panic, leaving 2 of his mercenaries behind, unconscious and thoroughly unwilling to talk once they woke. Senara left them tied to a tree with enough water to survive until a guild patrol found them, because whatever else she wasn't her enemy, and there was a difference worth keeping. "You're kinder than you let on," Elias observed, watching her check the ropes a second time. "Don't tell anyone," Senara said. "I have a reputation to maintain." They didn't stop running until the jungle canopy opened above the clearing where the second chance sat waiting, and even then they didn't stop so much as collapse against the ship's hull, both of them coated in dust and blood and the particular exhaustion of people who had, against every reasonable expectation, survived. Behind them, through gaps in the trees, the valley that had held the temple complex for centuries continued its slow, thunderous collapse, the jungle itself seeming to fold inward as the ground gave way beneath 1,000 years of ruins finally allowed to rest. "We should go," Elias said, though he made no move to actually stand. "Before the ground decides we should go with it." "In a minute." Senara stared at the settling dust where the temple had been. In her hand, she hadn't even noticed picking it up in the chaos, was a single fragment of the shattered crystal, no bigger than her thumbnail, its glow long since faded to a dull, ordinary gray. "I didn't get to keep any of it. No specimens. No proof. 20 years of searching and I'm walking away with nothing." "You're not walking away with nothing," Elias said. Senara looked down at the fragment in her palm, and then, for the first time, really looked at it. Because there, etched into the crystal's flat inner face in lines too fine to have been carved by any tool Senara recognized, was a short line of Vulpine script, unmistakably, achingly familiar, in handwriting she'd know anywhere because she'd spent 20 years staring at journal entries written in that exact hand. Her mother's handwriting. Left in the crystal, somehow, in whatever way the heart preserved everyone who'd ever touched it. One final message, waiting 20 years for someone to break the crystal open enough to find it. Senara translated it silently first, mouth moving without sound, and then, because some things needed saying out loud to be real, read it again to Elias. "The greatest discoveries are the people worth coming home to." Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Somewhere behind them, the valley finished its collapse with one final, distant boom, and then Talaris went quiet, indifferent to what it had cost and what it had given back. "She'd have liked you," Senara said finally, throat tight. "Annoyingly. She'd have liked you a lot." "I'd have stolen her ship instead of yours," Elias said. "Given the choice." Senara laughed, wet and real, and leaned her head against his shoulder without deciding to, and he let her stay there. The flight off Talaris was quiet in a way the flight in hadn't been. No storm, no argument, just the low hum of the second chance's engines and the two of them sitting shoulder to shoulder in a cockpit that had briefly, on the way down, felt like the most dangerous place in the galaxy and now, on the way up, felt like something closer to safe. "So," Elias said, eyes on the stars opening up beyond the viewport as Talaris fell away behind them. "Does this mean you've forgiven me?" Senara considered the question with the seriousness of someone weighing an important excavation decision. She considered 5 years of anger, and a stolen map, and a threshold of teeth, and a rope bridge, and flooded catacombs full of her mother's warning, and a trap chamber her own tale had detonated with gleeful abandon, and a hand that had caught hers over a widening chasm and hadn't let go. She considered mostly the fact that he'd promised to run and hadn't. Not really, not when it counted, not for either of the 2 times it mattered. Senara leaned over, kissed him, not gently, not as an apology, but the way she did everything, entirely without half measures, and settled back into her seat with the distinct satisfaction of a woman who had just won an argument she hadn't technically finished. "Absolutely not," she said. Elias blinked, touched 2 fingers to his own mouth like he was checking it was real, and grinned. The real one, not the performance. "Fair enough. I'll earn it eventually." "You will," Senara agreed. Slowly. Possibly never. I haven't decided yet. She reached into her satchel and pulled out her mother's old field journal, flipping past the pages she'd read 1,000 times to a section near the back she'd never had reason to fully translate before, a section that referenced, in passing, in her mother's characteristically understated handwriting, a second site. A temple further north, older than the one they just left in ruins, marked on an old star chart with a single word Senara had spent years assuming was decorative. Coming. Not a place name. A promise. Her mother, 20 years ago, already planning the trip she never got to take. What's that look? Elias said, watching her face. Senara turned the journal so he could see the star chart, and the coordinates circled twice in her mother's hand, and reached over to take back. Finally, properly, permanently, the stolen map still folded in the inside pocket of Elias's jacket, the one he hadn't given back yet because some part of him, she suspected, had been hoping for exactly this moment. There's another temple, she said. Older. My mother marked it before she ever found the first one. She looked up at him, tail curling with unmistakable, unrepentant delight around the back of her seat. And this time, Rook, you're coming with me. Not because you owe me. Not because someone's threatening either of us. Because I'm asking. Elias Rook, smuggler, thief, unreliable pilot of a ship named for exactly the thing he kept trying, badly and stubbornly and finally sincerely, to earn, reached over and set a course for the coordinates without a single word of argument. Try not to fall in love with the next temple, he said instead, echoing his own words from a lifetime ago, back when the jungle had still been a stranger and the woman beside him had still been someone he was afraid to want back. Everyone does. Too late, Senara said, and wasn't entirely sure anymore whether she meant the temple, the mother she'd finally understood, or the man currently plotting a course toward the next impossible thing at her side. Way too late. The second chance turned its nose toward a fresh horizon of stars, and behind them, Talaris kept its secrets, and it's dead the way it always had, quietly, patiently, waiting for the next veil stubborn enough to come looking.